And I'd like to focus our attention on maybe the broader history of the minimum wage. And I'm going to use the U.S. I know Illinois has often had a higher rate than that, but there's some nice charts. I'm going to refer to one provided by CNN Money. They have a chart they put together back in 2015 that tracks the minimum wage. And one of the things we've talked about is making sure the minimum wage is what it needs to be to support families. Well, the Consumer Price Index, the way it increases, is designed to help us keep track of that. So we can look at that as to say, what might the minimum wage have been if it really kept pace with inflation? And what you'll see is it has bounced up and down over the years since 1938 when the federal government first put it into place. The heyday of the minimum wage was arguably in the 1960s and 1970s. It reached its highest level historically, adjusted for inflation. Makes sense, that was during the War on Poverty, a lot of programs that were first going into place to really try to address and make the minimum wage perform in a way that was supportive beyond where it originally was back in 1938. So let's look at those numbers. If I take those 2 decades, the 1960s and 1970s, and I look at the median value, and then I adjust that for inflation, bring it up to 2017, what you find is that median adjusted for inflation is $9.57. That's based on the minimum wage during the 2 decades of its heyday. You say, well, maybe some of those were averaging it down too much. Well, let's look at the highest federal minimum wage adjusted for inflation. That was 1968. Yeah, the minimum wage was only $1.60, but in today's dollars, that's $11.02. $11, that's the highest adjusted for inflation minimum wage in American history, $11.02. Now, you might say, well, maybe that's out of line with our suggestions. In the State of the Union address in 2013, President Obama proposed a $9 minimum wage. Well, that's 2013. Let's adjust that for inflation. In today's dollars, that's $9.45. Interesting, very consistent with that range, which was the median over the heyday of the minimum wage. I think that was probably a very reasonable place to look. The following year, in the 2014 State of the Union address, the president came back and proposed a rate of $10.10. That was a pretty big jump from $9, but adjusted for inflation, that's $10.43, so that's certainly still within the range below the maximum consistent with U.S. history for the minimum wage. I don't think those are unreasonable proposals. I think that maybe we should be looking at adjustments that bring us in line with where inflation would be. But that's not what this bill says. This bill gets to that point pretty quickly. It gets up to $10 by the beginning of 2019. And already by the beginning of 2020, it would be at $11.25 beyond that highest historical level, and it grows from there. In fact, it's interesting to note that if I just look at the last 3 years as it rises to $15, the increases those years, now the increases were large the first couple of years to catch up, a 9.1% increase in the first jump, 11.1% increase in the second jump, but from there it goes to 11.3%, 15.6%, and 15.4% jumps, well beyond what it takes to catch up to historical levels, right? Because getting up to $11, I get to the highest historical level in U.S. history. Let's put some context for the kind of inflationary pressure that those out years of those increases would create. And again, I'm going to go back and look at U.S. history. The 1970s. Those who are here, some of us might have been alive and remember some of the 1970s, was the highest inflationary decade in most people's memory in the United States. The average inflation during that decade per year was 11.2%. So the out years of this bill, all 3 years exceed the inflation of the highest, the worst inflation in U.S. history. So both in comparing to where the natural value should be, if you want to catch up and bring it to where people envision this, you'd be somewhere in the $10 range, give or take. And you certainly would not be increasing it by rates that are running 4 times.
Please bring your remarks to a close, sir.
Thank you, Speaker. 4 times, 5 times, well beyond the current CPI adjustment. Please vote no.